Welcome to the deep dive. You ready to jump in?
Always. What are we looking at today?
Today we're diving deep into Baguazhang Qigong, specifically through these 64 illustrations inspired by the I-Ching.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, and the document is called the Baguazhang Qigong Illustrated through 64 I-Ching Inspired Postures
Okay.
by Peter Hainzl. And the goal of this deep dive is really to extract like the core concepts and connections that are in this memorial,
Right.
and ultimately give you a clearer picture of what this practice is all about.
I think what's so fascinating about this right off the bat is that you have a martial art that's steeped in Taoist philosophy, and then you have the whole practice of energy cultivation, and then they're kind of brought together through these illustrations visually.
Right.
So there's a lot of layers here that are going to be really interesting to unpack.
Yeah, and especially for you, the listener, you know someone who enjoys efficient learning and having those aha moments
Right.
without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah.
That's what we're aiming for today. So we're going to try to unpack these concepts in a way that is digestible and insightful for you.
Cool.
So I think a good place to start is with the author's philosophy on Qigong,
Yeah.
because he takes a pretty unique stance.
He does, yeah. So Peter Hainzl really sees himself as more of a guide,
Okay.
helping students kind of discover their own innate chi or internal life energy. And he really pushes back against the idea of being a traditional teacher or a master.
Sure.
You know, he's not putting himself out there as somebody who has mastered anything.
He's very upfront about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's very straightforward in the way he says it.
Right. Like no magic.
Yeah.
No woo.
Right.
No quack charlatan stuff.
Exactly. But then he goes on to say something really interesting.
Okay.
He actually mentions that his public-facing content, like the podcasts and articles he publishes, he considers those a high-censored, sanitized version.
Interesting. So there's another level.
Well, yeah, it makes you wonder what he's holding back. Right. I mean, he's really grounding the practice in a very practical way, but at the same time, he's hinting at maybe deeper experiences, like paradigm-shifting experiences, that he doesn't really want to talk about publicly. So I think
That's fascinating.
yeah, and for you, the learner, it kind of indicates that there might be something more
Right?
to discover if you stick with this long term.
Deeper levels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what those unbelievable experiences he mentioned actually are.
It definitely sparks that curiosity.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we've talked about his perspective on teaching and learning.
Right.
Now let's move into the fundamental understanding of what Qigong is,
Okay.
as he describes it.
Sure.
So a good place to start is with the literal translation from Chinese,
Yeah.
which is energy work.
Yeah. I mean, energy work, that's really what it's all about, right?
Right.
And in a lot of Western interpretations of Qigong, the focus is really on cultivating that internal energy for longevity and well-being. And a lot of that has to do with the breathing techniques and the postures that you do to kind of facilitate that flow.
Yeah, and he also mentions that it's not just about breath and posture, but it's
Right.
also about things like your diet and the environment you're in.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected, right? So
Right,
you can't
yeah.
really separate those things.
Yeah, and I like how he brings in parallels with other traditions.
Yeah.
So he mentions things like Reiki in Japan,
Uh-huh.
or the ancient connections to yoga and Ayurvedic medicine in India.
Right.
So it kind of gives you that bigger picture
Right.
of these different practices.
It shows you that Qigong isn't just some isolated thing.
Right.
It's part of a bigger tradition of
Yeah.
energy-based practices that are all kind of aiming at the same thing.
Yeah, and he also clarifies that Qigong isn't always a standalone discipline. So it can be practiced by itself,
Right.
but it's also often integrated into other practices,
Exactly.
which is why you see it
Yeah.
in things like Tai Chi.
Right. But what I thought was really interesting is his emphasis on how broad Qigong is within Chinese heritage. Like, he points out that it's not just about health and wellness like we often see in the West.
Okay.
It's used for medical treatments and even for things that are more like spiritual or esoteric.
Right.
So it's a much wider range of applications.
Okay. And this is interesting, too, because he actually came to Qigong through Baguazhang.
Right.
He didn't initially seek out Qigong.
Right.
He was doing this internal martial art.
Yeah.
And he talked about how after like 8 years
Wow.
of intense daily practice.
That's a long time.
Right. He really emphasizes that daily practice, that these two practices became intertwined.
It really highlights how much dedication goes into it. And he
Yeah.
gives some really practical advice, too.
Okay.
He says if you're looking to learn Qigong, It's so important to find an instructor who can break down these complex ideas
Right.
into something you can understand.
That makes sense.
Right, because it can get pretty abstract.
Right.
So having someone who can explain it clearly is crucial.
Yeah, and he also highlights the importance of defining your own goals for Qigong.
Yeah.
And he's very upfront about the fact that his focus is on Qigong as it relates to Baguazhang.
Right.
Not Tai Chi, not Shaolin,
Right.
not other forms.
Exactly.
So that's his lens.
Yeah, that sets the framework for everything else.
Right.
Okay, so let's dig into Baguazhang Qigong specifically.
Okay.
He identifies Baguazhang as a Taoist martial art, which already connects it to this whole philosophy of balance and harmony with nature.
Right.
And then Baguazhang Qigong, as he presents it, is kind of the healing aspect of this martial art, which is a really interesting concept.
It is.
Right? Because in the West, we tend to think of martial arts as all about fighting and strength.
Strength and violence.
Yeah, exactly. But here, he's saying that mastery in combat can actually be linked to healing. You know, it's about that ability to give life, not just take it.
Right.
Which I think is a really profound idea.
Yeah, and he actually acknowledges that this might sound kind of weak.
He does. He actually uses the term pussy weak, which is pretty direct.
It is.
But he's just being real, right?
Right.
He knows that that's how some people might see it. But he argues that from an Eastern perspective, there's actually a lot of strength in the idea that something can both take and give.
Right.
It's about understanding the cyclical nature of energy.
And he even shares a personal reflection about how his understanding of strength has changed over time.
He does. He talks about how, as a teenager, he had that typical Western view of strength, like physical dominance.
Right.
But then through his own experiences with violence, his perspective shifted, and that's reflected in his practice.
So it's not just theoretical for him.
Not at all. It's very personal.
All right, so now let's get to the illustrations themselves. What was his primary motivation for creating these?
Well, he says very simply, because I wanted to.
Oh, okay.
Which is kind of refreshing.
Yeah, it's straightforward.
Yeah. But he also elaborates a bit.
Okay.
And he says he really wanted to bridge the gap in understanding the deeper levels of Baguazhang.
Okay.
Especially for Western practitioners.
Okay. And this is where the I-Ching comes in, right?
Exactly. So he explains that Baguazhang translates to 8 changing palms or 8 element palms. And these 8 elements are all tied to the I-Ching.
Okay.
Which is all about change and the fundamental forces of reality.
Right.
And he makes a really good point that a lot of people who practice Baguazhang might not fully grasp this connection to the I-Ching.
Yeah, especially in the West.
Especially in the West. And as a result, they might be missing a whole level of depth
to
their understanding of the art.
And he's very aware of all the cultural and mystical esoteric fluff.
Yeah, he calls it out directly. Because he knows that can be a real barrier for Westerners.
Right, like it's hard to just take things on faith.
Exactly. We want evidence.
We want understanding.
That's when you understand. That's where the illustrations come in.
Right.
Because he understands that the subconscious mind works differently than the conscious mind.
Right. Our conscious mind can grasp the mechanics of a technique. But our subconscious mind responds to symbols on a much deeper level.
So these illustrations are meant to speak to that part of us.
Exactly. The idea is that by looking at them, our subconscious mind will start to pick up on those deeper connections.
Okay. So can you give us a general idea of what those symbols might be?
Well, he doesn't go into too much detail in the document itself.
Okay.
But we know that each illustration pairs a Baguazhang posture with an I-Ching hexagram, which is already a very potent symbol.
Right.
So the idea is that the posture itself is a physical embodiment of energy.
And then the hexagram represents a specific state of change or a fundamental principle.
Okay.
So by putting those two together, your subconscious mind might start to intuitively grasp those energetic connections.
Interesting.
Without needing a whole intellectual explanation. So it's about tapping into that deeper level of knowing.
Okay. So each illustration features his character Melonhead.
Yes. Melonhead is demonstrating a recognizable Baguazhang posture. But he's very clear that these aren't specific to any one style.
Okay.
They're drawn from a range of common stances.
Right.
And then you have the I-Ching hexagram, which is from the Mawangdui Yujing sequence.
Okay, and what's special about that?
So that's an earlier version of the I-Ching that was found in archaeological digs. And the hexagrams are ordered differently than in the more common translations. And he felt that this sequence was more aligned with the energy he wanted to convey.
Interesting.
So it's a very deliberate choice.
Yeah.
And then you have the Chinese characters that accompany each illustration. And these are actually based on his own personal experiences, not from the traditional texts. And he doesn't translate them.
Interesting.
He wants you to contemplate them on your own.
Right.
And then there are these energy circles that you'll see.
Yeah, what are those all about?
He describes them as visual aids.
Okay.
They're meant to help you feel the flow of qi in and around your body.
Okay.
So it's a way of visualizing that energy.
And he says these can help refine your Baguazhang forms and palm changes.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does he suggest we actually use this book?
Well, he starts by assuming that anyone who's interested in this already has some basic knowledge of Baguazhang, Qigong, or the I-Ching.
Right.
And he says there are two main reasons why someone might be drawn to this.
Okay.
Either they want to deepen their understanding, or they're feeling stuck in their training. And for those who are looking to deepen their understanding, he recommends something very simple.
Okay.
Just look at the pictures and let your subconscious mind do its thing. Don't overthink it.
Okay.
Just let the images wash over you.
That's interesting.
And then he talks about this idea of realization or enlightenment, and he demystifies it a bit.
Okay.
He says it's not always this big dramatic awakening.
Right.
It can be as simple as turning on a light in a dark room.
Okay.
It's about gaining clarity. And he also points out that sometimes feeling stuck is actually a way of avoiding the thing that's causing the stagnation. So gaining clarity allows you to face those obstacles head on.
So it's about seeing what's really there.
Exactly. Now, if you're already familiar with the I-Ching, he suggests using these illustrations to enrich your understanding.
Okay.
Even though he doesn't give specific instructions
Right.
on how to connect the poses and the hexagrams.
So it's more about personal interpretation.
Exactly. And then finally, he encourages everyone to add their own notes and interpretations to the book as they gain their own insights.
Right.
So it's about creating a dialogue between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind.
Okay. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Peter Hainzl's work, what are the key takeaways for you, the listener?
Well, I think it's important to remember his emphasis on self-discovery when it comes to energy work.
Right.
And then the connection between Baguazhang as a Taoist martial art and Qigong as its healing aspect.
Right.
And we've also explored how these illustrations are designed to speak to your subconscious mind, to accelerate your learning,
Right.
and to help you break through those plateaus.
Yeah, and that idea of enlightenment as simply gaining clarity.
Yeah, I like that.
It's very accessible.
It is. It's very down to earth.
Right.
And it makes it seem much more achievable.
So a final thought for you, the listener. The author emphasizes how the subconscious mind learns differently and how it responds to symbolism.
Right.
So think about this. In what other areas of your life could you benefit from engaging with concepts on a more intuitive level?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah. Could exploring symbols unlock new avenues of understanding for you?
Like in the same way that Peter Hainzl proposes for Baguazhang and Qigong.
Right.
That's something to really think about.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time. See you then.